Welcome to Interpreting Scale from Portrait to 3D. This is the first of 4 videos that I've made for the CoCoVid event, brought to you by CostTube, naturally. This is probably the last one, or close to the last one today, of hopefully a fun-filled day of CoCoVid videos. And you can find out more about the scheduling and so forth on the there is a badge available for those who are interested in playing along. More information on how to get the badge and play along is on the CostTube CoCoVid Discord server, link below. So when we are looking at costumes, we want to take anatomy into consideration so that we can see where it hits on the body that is underneath all of those clothes. Now, there are definite mile markers that can make that much easier. It's the same sort of assumptions that you make with drafting, that there are average ratios that most humans fall into within give or take a certain amount. And we can break down costumes based off of that. My favorite measurement to break down by is by the head. Most portraits have a head, and it breaks down into very convenient chunks for costume purposes. Here we have lines at the same distance from the top of the head to the bottom part of the chin, that you can take that same measurement and break it down throughout the body to see what kind of figure you're working with and find some very important mile markers. For example, the first one down from the chin is the bust or chest line. The next one down from that is the natural waist, and the next one down from that is the low hip. And depending on what figure you have, it'll either be an 8-head figure, or if you're looking at some of the modern fashion figures, they may be 9 heads as well. So the reason why fashion figures have 9 heads rather than 8 heads is the theory of looking at the figure from forced perspective. If you're looking at the figure if you are sitting at their feet looking up, oftentimes the legs look that much longer, and that's a very desirable effect for a lot of fashionable figures. Now, if you're looking at what's the most accurate kind of figure, as far as if you're looking at someone straight on, that's more of the 8-head figure, and that's what we're going to be working with primarily today. Another thing to consider with drawn figures is that sometimes you aren't given a face, but fear not. For the most part, eyes are about halfway through the head, and that can be very helpful too to figure out how big the head is for that particular measurement. I'm sure you're thinking that's all well and good, but what? Oh no, if our figures here have on clothes, such as this jaunty hat here, or if our lovely Vitruvian man over here has a skirt, how do we determine where that hits on the body from there? So you can add lines on top of there, and you can, if you have a jaunty hat and cannot tell how tall your head is, but you can find where the eyes are, then you can use that to help figure out how big your head is. And then from there, where the lowest part of the hip is, such as on the skirt where the button placket there, goes down just as far as the lowest part of the hip. And you can also figure out the width of the hem, roughly based off of the head size as well. So let's put that to some use with these figures here as a start towards putting this to use. So our first figure on the left here is 9 heads high. She's in some serious platform shoes, but as you can see, she has a fairly high modern bust line. The waist hits about where you would expect, but if we want to figure out how wide that hem is, this is a good example of that. We've taken her head as the main measurement in a face of, let's say, 8.5 inches. 5 faces fit from right to left. We multiply that by pi, and we'll get a rough circumference to be able to work from, or another thing, unless I'm working with hoops or whatever, I do tend to like just marking out the basic width as well with blue tape on the floor. So next figure over, we have a basic 8 heads high, and we can tell that she has a fairly raised bust line, so you can see the fullness that comes fuller at the curve, slightly higher than the bust line based off of her head measurement. The waistline is absolutely much higher, and you can kind of see how the elbow would more or less line up with the natural waist if her arm was straight. Same thing with our figure on the left there, and that's very helpful as well. So the figures on the right here are also 8 heads high. You can also see here that the bust line is definitely raised up a bit, as well as the natural waistline, to be able to get that very long-legged look. You can also figure out more or less how big the bustle is as well if you wanted to, but here I decided to go more into the train. And so from her toe to the end of the train there is a roughly 4.5-foot train. Alright, so let's move on to one of my favorite websites that has one of my favorite examples of extreme silhouettes that are actually completely plausible. The link is below for this as well. She's gone through and marked out the scale of this very dramatic, wonderful late Elizabethan portrait of Queen Elizabeth I, and figured out exactly where a modern figure would sit in that. Right? We look at this figure with all of the optical illusions in place, and it feels impossible, right? The waist feels impossibly small, that the figure is incredibly distorted. But when you look at it with the regular modern sort of body superimposed, it looks very reasonable. If you want more practice with fairly realistic looking croquis or models for drawing, I would highly recommend this website as well as one other that I've linked below, but that one has nudity in it, so be forewarned. This one has pretty much everyone in bathing suits, but they have a wide variety of figures, which is very useful for figuring out averages versus applied sizes, right? All right, so let's put some of this to use too, and some of the things that we can assume based off of some of these lovely portraits as well. So if we look at Mae West here, we can definitely see, based off of her head measurement, that she probably has to be wearing some very tall shoes, maybe even platforms to be able to get that tall. And look at how wide that dramatic collar is. It's almost to her elbow. Now, the figure in the middle here, one of the great things that we can tell, even though she's sitting, is how high that bust line is, and is how high the waist is in relation to that as well, and how far up the pleats go. We can also see with the figure on the far right how high that waist is and how low the neckline is based off of her head measurement as well. We can also figure out, despite the fact that her elbows are completely obscured, roughly how long those sleeves are and where her elbows are underneath that, as well as, how long her legs are. Now, of course, you would want to augment a lot of this with research and extant examples, as well as contemporary accounts and so forth, as to figure out what's more likely as opposed to what's a fashionable figure. But it's amazing how close you can get to a fashionable figure with taking these kind of silhouettes and this kind of scaling to mind. For example, if you want to figure out what kind of shape the hoop is on the left here, you can figure that out doing the same sort of equations that we did earlier with the circumference and the radius based off of the head measurement. And the same sort of thing with the photo on the right. You have these women dressed in these wonderful suffragette outfits, and we have a tendency to try and scale things back to be acceptable to a modern audience. But look at that hair bow. It is bigger than her head, and it is wonderful. Same sort of thing with how much blousing there is and what the ideal figure is. Putting modern editorial takes on it is something that we can't really help doing completely, but it is something to keep in mind, and I hope that this interpreting scale video has helped you understand how to break down a portrait a little bit easier in the very basics so that you can not be intimidated by very striking silhouettes and be able to dive into it and take the world by storm with your really amazing silhouettes and the correct ratios to really draw the eye to the very specific period or to the crazy cosplay that you want to do or fantasy inspired things. Go big or go home, right? And in this case, especially big, and you'll know exactly how much. Now, I do have another class that goes into how to interpret the density of the fabrics and the scale and so forth, but you'll have to wait for that until next Saturday with my Reading Wrinkles class, which I hope will help round out this one as well, to be able to look at a two-dimensional object or representation and make informed choices as to how you're going to change it into three-dimensional garment. And that's it for now. I hope you have a wonderful next day 2 of the CoCoVid costume extravaganza.